It's 6 minutes past 2. Thank you so much for staying with us. If you've done so, and if you've just tuned in, welcome to Cape Talk this afternoon. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome in studio my next guest, who is an author, an activist, a political thinker. Dr Mamphela Ramphele leads very little by way of introduction, but if you'll bear with me for a second, let me just remind you, in case there is one person listening who doesn't know her background, that she is a medical doctor. She was a founder of the Black Consciousness Movement with Steve Biko, was detained by apartheid authorities, later banned to the town of Tzaneen, that her illustrious post-apartheid career has included stints as Vice-Chancellor of UCT, as Managing Director at the World Bank, a Director of IDASA, and a Trustee of the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And besides all of that, and where she found the time to do anything in between all of that, she's written several books, the latest of which is called Dreams, Betrayal and Hope, reflecting on the state of the nation, reflecting on her own foray into party politics through Ahang, and reflecting on her deep concerns about the state of education in particular in South Africa. Doctor, it's wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much for making a big chunk of time available to us today, and welcome to Cape Talk.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to your listeners for tuning in.
I hope they are going to do more than tune in. I hope they're going to join the conversation and ask questions and make comments, which you are welcome to do if you're listening. You can be watching as well. By the way, we're streaming the interview live on Facebook on the Cape Talk page if you'd like to watch as well as listen. But just a reminder that if you've got something you'd like to ask or know, you can either call us on 021 446 0567. You can send an SMS to 31567, or you can leave a voice note on WhatsApp, and the number there is 072 567 1567. Doctor, you open your book with the image of a dream betrayed, a sense that we've strayed so very far away as a nation from the dream that your generation dreamed of when you fought for freedom. And you describe in great detail your engagement with young South Africans in particular, and feeling a sense of at the same time pride and shame. Pride in what your generation achieved in fighting for freedom, but also a sense of shame at what hasn't happened. Could you elaborate? Where is that sense of shame from? Is it a sense of personal responsibility or a collective loss of the vision that you once held?
It's sadness more than shame. It's sadness about our inability to live the dream that inspired us to sacrifice our youth and dedicate ourselves to the struggle for freedom, knowing, and all the time knowing, that we are going to either die fighting for freedom or succeed in seeing freedom get birthed. I'm one of the few out of a small group of 15 people who started this journey together, who had the good fortune to see freedom born in 1994 and to be part of the story of translating the dream into reality. Sadly, 23 years down the line, you look back and you realize how we have failed to change the lives of 80% of South Africa's people. And the most painful reality is how we have failed in the most fundamental, what I call the greatest betrayal, is our failure to transform the education system, which shouldn't have been too big a deal, because the knowledge is there, the technical details are there, and the money is there. We are one of the countries that spend a big chunk of our government expenditure on education. And yet, our government, or let me say successive governments since 1994, have failed to manage the transition from the apartheid education to an education that would educate for citizenship in a constitutional democracy and enable young people to be proud contributors to this beautiful country.
You talk about the lack of management, but you also talk about a lack of vision, a sort of a disconnect. You mentioned in one point Minister Angie Motshekga herself acknowledging that education is in a state of crisis, but not seeming to be able to take the next step of reflecting and saying, what responsibility do I bear for that situation? What role have I played in creating that crisis?
The failure of management and the failure of vision are, in a sense, intertwined. The failure of vision is our failure to recognize that when you have inherited a system that taught people that they were inferior, that they could not do math, they couldn't think in 3 dimensions, you really needed to be very strategic in making sure you frame an education system that will not only create broader knowledge, but also heal the inferiority complex that was left by the apartheid system. But we didn't do that. We instead tried to introduce a very foreign concept called outcomes-based education, which was a disaster. And that was because of the failure of the post-apartheid government to listen to people who had lived here, who were active here, who had experimented with ways in which we could actually create alternative education systems. But the failure of management has at its root the conflict of interests of the ANC in relation to the largest trade union of teachers, SADTU. That they are unable to manage teachers who are members of SADTU because they fear losing the votes that SADTU represents with these nearly 250,000 people, which when you multiply them by each family, it's a huge chunk of their vote. So there, in a sense, one could put it crudely and say the ANC has chosen to remain in power with the help of SADTU at the expense of making teachers more accountable and more focused on their performance as teachers.
Almost a sense of protecting the teachers rather than protecting the interests of the young people that they're meant to be educating.
Yes, which is actually eating the seed of the future.
Lovely way of putting it. Education, one of many issues you touched on, one of many failures of management and failures of leadership that you point to and lay squarely at the feet of the ANC. The one question that you asked in the book, which really has stuck with me since reading it, is asking specifically of the president, why has a man who spent his younger decades fighting for freedom as you did, who sacrificed as you and many others of your generation did, who gave it all for that dream, why has somebody who once held so close to that dream given it up and betrayed the ideals of that dream so thoroughly? What do you think it is? Is it simply because he found that he could and it was very easy for him to get away with it, so he did?
I think the most fundamental reason for the failure of the post-apartheid government to live the dream is the failure to make the transition from liberation politics, which was about them and us. So, as President Zuma has put it so crudely, that as far as he's concerned, what comes first, the country or the ANC? And the ANC, of course, he says.
His answer.
So he hasn't even adopted the role of being a citizen of a constitutional democracy, let alone the role of being a guardian of that constitution, which, amongst others, requires him to make sure that young people are given the education they need so that they can be the contributors that this country needs to be able to build a broader base. But it is also a reflection of something else, that because when we signed up on the Constitution, in the preamble of our Constitution, we say we the people adopt this Constitution so as to, and we list 4 things, to heal the divisions of the past and establish the values of a democratic system. We said we want to establish a democracy, open society where there is equality for everybody. We said we are establishing a society where the quality of life of everybody will be of major concern so that we can free the human potential. And finally, that we will build the kind of nation that will take its proud place as a sovereign nation in the family of nations. Now, those are the 4 commitments we made. Now, look at what we did. What we did, we simply signed that Constitution, and many people, every time I talk to young people, I ask, have you ever read the Constitution? They've never done so. Because we didn't actually go on a drive to broaden the understanding of what the commitments we have made, but importantly, to implement them. This country, unlike many countries, doesn't have civic education in the school system, yet we've got life orientation, and it should be there. It doesn't have citizen education in the workplace. It doesn't have citizen education in the places of worship. And so we have, in a sense, as citizens of this country, we are driving this constitution without a license. And so it is in the mind of people who are using the state for personal enrichment, they are compensating themselves. And I think President Zuma is a prime example, compensating himself for the sacrifices he made during the struggle. Now that is not compensation, that's theft. Because he's not the only one who sacrificed. Many people sacrificed. Some paid the ultimate price. But what we should have done as a nation is to have those conversations of healing so we could put behind us the anger, the guilt, the shame, and to transform our socio-economic setup so that every South African would feel that they've got a stake in the country. So instead of him being part of the leadership that helps us to complement our political settlement with an emotional settlement and a socio-economic settlement, he's helping himself. That's not what has been expected or what we expect our leaders to do.
Now, you yourself made an attempt to become part of the solution when you decided to enter into party politics. It was something you'd stayed out of deliberately for a long time. I know Madiba wanted you to join the ANC, wanted you to join his cabinet, and you declined on the grounds that you felt you had more to offer from an independent perspective. What changed your mind and made you decide with the Gang that you were going to enter into party political politics and try and fight the battle from that perspective? What changed?
What changed was desperation. When you don't see an end in sight. That's how I felt in 2012, 2013 and 14. And so I thought if there was, because a lot of people would say, I don't even vote because I've given up on the politics of this country. There's nobody to vote for. So I thought, well, perhaps if one had an alternative that focused on those values that we said we wanted to establish, that focus on citizens as the real owners of the democracy, then perhaps we could have changed. But it was a big miscalculation and a betrayal of my own commitment not to get into party politics. But the miscalculation is really at several levels. First, the loyalty to the ANC is not one that you can undo by argument. It's very deep. It's like people being loyal to a church. And I underestimated that. And without the emotional healing that I refer to in the book, it's difficult for people to untangle themselves from an organization that claims to be their liberator, which has turned into, in a sense, a contributor to their oppression. The second thing is the issue of the black-white issue is still very strong. And so people are very afraid of what would happen if white people were again to have authority. And that's why I think a lot of people were very uncomfortable with any suggestion of working with the DA. And so I believe that South Africans are too raw from the wounds of the past to be able to be comfortable with alternative politics, which is why this book is focusing on the importance of complementing the political settlement of 1994 with an emotional healing so that we can be South African citizens without having to call ourselves black, white, or Zulu or Xhosa, so that we can live that reality of being citizens of a constitutional South Africa. But we also have to complement that political settlement with a socio-economic settlement. There is no way you can have a country where 10% of the population owns 60 to 65% of the wealth and almost 80% of that 10% are white people, which means that the legacy of the past lives very much, is very much alive in 23 years down the line. And it's not the kind of change that will happen through BEE or through corporate social investment. It requires a rethinking of how this economy works. How do we make sure that we've got the reach, the inclusion of all those young people who are walking our streets, smart, energetic, but totally dejected because they cannot find work and they cannot find funding for the ideas that they have as entrepreneurs.
If you've just joined us late to the conversation, my guest in studio today is Dr Mamphela Ramphele, talking to us about her new book, Dreams, Betrayal and Hope. I'll repeat the invitation that if you've got a question for her, you're welcome to call in on 021 446 0567 or to tweet us at Cape Talk. You also have our SMS line at your disposal, 31567. I have had a few SMSs just going back to Ahang, if I may, before we move on, asking about what happened. The famous meltdown of the situation with Helen Zille, where one moment in early February of that year, 2014, you are being announced as the presidential candidate. There is talk of a merger between the DA and Ahang, and within days, that vision lies in tatters. It was a moment that I think held so much hope for so many people who saw what you did, the potential for something new, for something that was palatable to vote for, in the absence of a credible alternative. But it was a moment that proved fleeting. What went wrong in those particular days and weeks?
What went wrong is simply conservatives within the DA who realized that if, in fact, this partnership goes ahead, the DA would not be the same again. And they tried everything in the book to obstruct what we had agreed on, which was I would go back and consult with all of the branches of Ahang, or at least the regions, so that I fulfill the obligation in terms of the constitution of Ahang to consult and get people to agree or not to agree that we go this route. We already got the Western Cape to agree, Gauteng to agree, and I was due to go to Mpumalanga and the other regions. Suddenly, on a Friday, I get this SMS urgent meeting. You've got to sign up now. And I said, but we had agreed that I'm still going to do these other things. Yes, but we have to really get this thing done. I said, this sounds very funny. And of course, Helen Zille goes to the Sunday papers to say she either signs to be a member of the DA or else the deal is off. Now, she knows me well enough that I'm not that type of person who would agree to or else type of thing. Particularly because I wasn't doing it for myself. I wasn't pushing to be the person who's going to be the leader of this or the other thing, but it was about creating an alternative politics. Clearly, they were not ready for an alternative politics. And that's why they actually just obstructed the process. And so I had no choice but to say to the rest of Ahang, we've got to call this off because we are not going to be bulldozed into a relationship which basically what they wanted was to decapitate Ahang, take me to be their leader, and leave Ahang
in the wilderness.
Indeed.
Without absorbing the very policies and transformative items that you'd put on the table.
Because they didn't want
together.
They were not ready for transformation.
I hope we can leave it there and move on to current visions and dreams, if we may. But thank you for that SMS question. You've spent a lot of time meeting with young South Africans, talking with leaders of the student movement, with the so-called fallists, etc. And there is a sense of the urgency of their sense of betrayal, that there is a sense of reaching a point of no return, that they will not wait any longer, that they demand change now in whatever form it may come. They're calling for access to the system, for the doors to be opened for access to the system. But given what you've said to us about how dysfunctional and flawed that system is, do you think they're calling for the right thing? Should they be calling for immediate access to tertiary education as we have it, for example, or should there perhaps be a focus on redeveloping the system in its entirety?
Well, I believe that they are calling for the right thing, because you can't transform an education system in a matter of a few years. Where they are standing, the easiest and the quickest way of transforming the system in a way that will impact on their own careers and the careers of those just behind them is to make access, which was promised, the doors of education shall be open. And we also, in the Constitution, says we have to progressively make sure we realize the socio-economic rights. We say so in the Constitution. And the reality is that my generation, I'm a medical doctor today simply because the then bad apartheid had a full course bursary for me, half of which was repayable, the other part was written off. What if the bad apartheid government could do that? What stops this government from being able to establish a sustainable full course bursary for all the students who need it, who will then pay back by way of either working for the government for 3 years or for paying off as a monthly stipend when you get into a job? What stops us doing that? All countries in the world that really want to encourage equity in the system, they make sure that young people are not debarred from developing their skills and talents simply because they're poor. This is, in my view, the biggest betrayal. And the students who are calling for free or fee-free education for poor people, they're right. I absolutely agree with them. But they have also got to insist on the second thing, which is quality improvement. The quality of history that's been taught in our schools is a disgrace. 1652 is where they start from. Really, this ancient continent has been here, is the cradle of humanity, and yet our children are not taught anything about it. And I believe that we really need, as adults, as mothers, grandmothers, and fathers, we need to insist that the quality of teaching of history has to improve. And it won't take much to improve it because the material is there. The Silk Roads is one such book, which is a panoramic view of the history of the world, which would help young people to understand and help ignorant people like Helen Zille to also understand that long before Germany or Britain learned how to do water reticulation and sanitation, North Africa had already done it. The Asians had already done it. So Singapore is not thanks to Britain that is where it is. It's because the Asians were far more civilized than the Brits. So even people in that position are ignorant because they don't know their history. And so history for me is really important to lay the ground for understanding of where we come from so that we can map the future with greater confidence.
Now, before we run out of time, because we are almost out of time, my final question has to be the final word of your book's title. It's Dreams, Betrayal and Hope. Do you still hold out the hope that we can get there? You've touched on some of the methods you think that need to be engaged with to get us there. Do you think it is still possible to correct the course that we're on?
You just have to have seen the big marches that have happened. People are rediscovering the power that they have as citizens. And I believe if we can all go and open our constitutions and look at that preamble and commit to going to do the work of complementing the political settlement that we have with conversations about healing so that we can root out sexism, racism, and this tolerance of inequality. We need to also have conversations in the corporate sector, in the private sector and the government about how do we restructure this economy so that we can give it legs. It's now stagnant, amongst others, because only 20% of the people are participating in growing this economy. You can't grow an economy like that. Free the human potential, as we say in the preamble. Then you'll see this country will boom. It will have absolutely unlimited growth. Like we have seen with China, for 20-something years, they've been growing above 10%. We can do it here, but we need to free that human potential. And that means healing, and that means living the values of our Constitution. That means fundamental restructuring of our socioeconomic setup, so everybody feels they belong here. This is a beautiful country. I can't ever lose hope.
On that very positive note, thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Mamphela Ramphele. The book is called Dreams, Betrayal and Hope, and if you'd like to read in more depth the story behind that vision that she's just mapped out and how she thinks we can get there, you'll find it in major bookstores retailing at around 220 Rand a copy. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today.